Hello, I'm Bret, and you're the internet. And today I am going to go through a bunch of stuff about Compose. So if you've ever been here in the last year, 1 out of 2 shows I'm probably talking about Compose at some point. So I'm very excited. Docker talked a lot about it at DockerCon 2 weeks ago. Was that 2 weeks ago? I don't even remember. Might have been last week. Who knows? Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. And this is a preview of some updates that will happen at some time in the near future, this year maybe, on my courses around Compose, because Compose has changed a lot. And if you've been using Compose like you were using it 2 years ago, you're in for a whole treat today, because I have a laundry list of things that are new or better or maybe just sometimes different. And I want you to know about it. So I thought I'd cram it all into one live show and take your questions. So we're going to be focusing the conversation around Compose. This is not going to be a Q&A on all random things. I'm going to try to focus and get this all done in an hour to be respectful of your time so that you can learn everything there is about Compose. But first, a couple of announcements. Thanks to you that are patrons. So if you are aware, you probably are if you've been here before, I talk a lot about my Patreon. It is low traffic, basically one a week. Usually tells you what's going on my live show or if there's any updates or to my open source or my courses or anything like that. It's very low updates. It's not all the crap you get on Twitter and whatnot from me about Docker. So it's not going to be news. It's going to be what am I creating or what have I changed. So go here. You can sign up for free. You can actually just click the follow button and then you can use the app or the emails to follow. And then if you'd like to buy me a coffee a month and get some extra bonus features out of it, including monthly Zoom calls, feel free. I really appreciate all of you patrons. Thank you so much for keeping the hope alive that people will pay a few dollars a month for a whole lot of content and open source. So a couple of things happened this week unrelated to this. Just wanted to point out to you, if you haven't been paying attention to my Twitter retweets or anything like that, there is a GitOps Days conference from Weaveworks going on actually right now. You can go watch it instead of watching my channel. And they have yesterday's. I'm putting up the links to yesterday's video and today's video. So 2 days worth of content. Justin Cormack from Docker was actually one of the keynoters yesterday, and they're doing more stuff today. So go check that out. Actually, that was yesterday, and then that was today. Yeah, go check that out. And before we get started, I want you to know about the new Compose and its location on GitHub, because it's a new binary. It's different than the old binary. And that is going to get us to our first topic. I actually have a list today. I'm trying to be organized. Okay, so first thing you need to know is the new Docker Compose, what I used to call Docker space compose, because the only difference between the two when you're typing commands is Docker-compose or Docker space compose. The one we know for the one we've known for the last 6 years, I think, 6+ years, before it was called Fig way back in 2013. But since it's renamed Compose, it's always been Docker-compose for the command line. And of course, we just call the tool Compose, but when we say Compose, we mean lots of things. We're talking about the binary that you run at the command line. We're talking about the file format in YAML. We're talking about the specification behind that YAML, because there are other tools that integrate Compose into them, actually quite a few that I didn't know about. And they were trying to be compatible with the Compose YAML file and stuff. So what we're talking about in this particular topic is the CLI plugin version, which is now what they're doing. So if you were here just a year ago, even when this was brand spanking new of an idea and a project, and they were starting from scratch in Golang, not Python, which is, if you're using the original Docker Compose command line, that's all Python. And if you didn't know it, in the background, it's actually using PyInstaller, and the way it works, unless you're installing it with pip, is it's a big binary, and then every time you type a Docker Compose command, it would actually unpack that, execute Python to do your thing. One of the negatives, well, a couple of the negatives of that is, one, it actually would add about a half a second of delay. So automatically now in the new version, Docker space compose, you're getting faster execution on every single command. On the old, so it's approximately at least a half a second, if not faster, because there are some other things that we're going to talk about a little bit that make it even faster than the old version. And so they rewrote it from the ground up, and there's now basically it's installed via a plugin. And if you're not familiar with Docker plugins, let's check that out. So Docker plugins have been around a while, and they're listed in your .docker. I'm going to zoom in on this and hide that for now. So in your .docker directory, so at the root of your profile in your .docker directory, you have stuff. All right. One of those things is the CLI plugins directory. So if we look in there, you will see a list of all your plugins. Right now, I don't have any, because technically I'm using Docker Desktop. I'm on a Mac. So on Mac and Windows, when you're using Docker Desktop, it auto installs this plugin as well as some others that you can see with Docker info. Now, over the years, I've collected lots of different... Oh, right. I gotta change my context real quick. Docker. We'll talk about context in a bit. In a bit here. Use default. So I'm back on my machine, Docker info. And if we scroll up, so we'll see that I got 3 plugins. And it'll give you the version of those plugins. And the way that plugins work is, well, in Docker Desktop, they're basically in the package that you installed, Docker Desktop on your machine, and they're brought in that way. But they're technically separate binaries, and Docker extends its command line with those plugins. So the plugins is not new. That was years ago that they created the plugin idea, but I have these 3 plugins that essentially Docker will pull in these other executables and run them transparently. There are actually other ones out there. We're not going to go into that today, but I've had other shows in the past where we've talked about plugin model, and there's other plugins. I actually have created a few in the past. I kind of got away from it because I thought maybe Docker was getting away from plugins because they weren't making any new ones or whatever. But then they came out with Docker Scan for scanning your images, and then they came out with Docker Compose as a plugin. So who knows? They're still doing plugins. So anyway, if I were to download this binary, let's go back over to the command line. This has to do with the installation of this. If you are on Linux right now, if you're just on a Linux server or you running Linux desktop, the way you would get it, since you don't yet have Docker Desktop, is under the releases. So if we go to the Compose CLI repo, it's a binary often like you do other utilities, right? So you can go in here and go to the latest release and download the binary. Now, that's actually... Let me go to all releases. Thank you. So the latest one that they just released, so if you're on the latest Docker Desktop, I think it's 3.4 or 3.6. Let me make sure what version of Docker Desktop I'm using. The one that just came out days ago comes with this new beta 3 of the 2.0. So first step is to remember that this new thing, we're now calling it Docker Compose v2. That's not related to the YAML file format. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Docker Compose v2, or the next gen Compose. That's what they're calling it. So in Docker Desktop 3.4, which just released this week, you will now see this. So now at the command line, I can now do Docker Compose version, and I get an independent version of that Docker Compose, which is different if I did Docker-Compose. Okay, so this is using the old Python-based Compose version. And you see that it's a different version. It's got other things built into it because it's using the OpenSSL packaged into it through Python. And the Docker Space Compose, the Compose v2 version, is using all of the utility of Docker. So it gets its advantages from the Docker, which is also written in Golang. So there's library shared and stuff like that. So there's a lot of advantages and reasons for them to do this and rewrite it from scratch. But over at the website, you can see that I can now download these new versions as a binary, and I would just move that and just call it Compose, because the name of the file, so if I were to download this version, in fact, I just approve a point. Let's see if I can go find an old beta version. I'll prove a point to you. How you can do this on Linux. So I was looking for the beta. I'm looking for the beta 2. Let's see. Maybe they just retagged it or something. I don't know. That's possible. I think this one will work this way. All right, so I'm going to download. I'm on a Mac. So if I was on a Linux machine, I could download the Linux version. But I am on an AMD Mac. And what I would do, and there's installation instructions in that repo. but I would move from my downloads. What's the name of it? Docker Darwin AMD 64. All right. And then I would move that into .docker CLI and call it compose. All right. And now when I do a Docker compose version, let's see. Yeah, see these old, I don't want a cat, I want an LS. These older versions were not plugins. They were actually fully functioning command lines. So it may not work. So this is a bad example. I should get on a Linux machine and download this version. But the point is that's how you would do it. And their documentation on the website will tell you. They recently changed it from it being its own standalone binary that had Docker and everything built in. It was kind of like a special version of Docker command line. They changed it to be just a plugin. So, in fact, I bet you I wonder if I went back there, because I noticed those are 64 meg. And now they're only 20 some meg. So yeah, it's not going to work. But there was previously a beta 2 that I just could have proved to you that if I put something in that CLI plugins, it overwrites whatever is coming with Docker Desktop. So there's a way for you to now get newer beta versions, put it in that CLI directory, that CLI plugins directory, and you'll be good. I'm going to move that. All right. All right, so that's enough about the version, right? So we were talking about the CLI version, and it's Golang, and it's a plugin. It goes in that directory. So that way you can get it on Linux, you can use it on ARM, all that stuff. All right, next up, the compose spec. So compose spec is now the new version of the YAML file, essentially. So if you remember, way back in the day, compose YAML files in them didn't have a version. But then Docker wanted to create the idea of services. And this is going really back like 6 years. They wanted to create the idea of services in there. So they changed some things in the format and it wasn't compatible. So what they did was they changed the version statement at the top, or required a version statement at the top. So version :2. And then when they introduced swarm mode, they needed another version because the 2 didn't have the same compatibility. So they had to compose version 3. I, in a lot of my courses, will tell you to use compose version :2, like 2.7, I think is the latest, for local stuff, and only use the 3 versions for swarm, because swarm is really all the stuff that's in the 3 versions of the YAML file are really only applicable to swarm in most cases. So anyway, that all got really complicated. So now they've done away with all that. They're back to no version statement. And in fact, in this example, let's see, let's go to this directory. Actually, I'm going to stick in this one. Zoom in a little bit. And I'm now realizing that all of my topics are in the way of my text. All right, so in here, just have a single Docker compose file. Let me show you that file. So if you'll look at this file, there is no version in it. And that now means it is using the compose spec. And the compose spec is a superset of everything from version 2, everything from version 3, and then some. And we'll talk about some of the new features that we now have that you can't get in version 2 or 3. So in all of your compose files, and this little tidbit, by the way, this works in the old Docker compose with the dash in it, right? The Docker dash compose. So Python compose supports this as well. So for all of you that are using compose, take your version statement out. You don't need it anymore unless you're using swarm. So for Docker space compose and Docker dash compose, they now support the compose spec. And if you look over at the Docker website in the documentation, they will talk about that. So File. Let's see, we go over here, and you will see that these topics describe the Docker Compose implementation of the Compose format. Docker Compose 127, this is the older Python Compose, implements the format defined by the Compose specification. Previous Docker Compose versions have support for several Compose file formats, 2, 2x, 3x, and the Compose specification is a unified 2 and 3x file format, aggregating properties across these formats. So we can all now dump, as long as you're not using Swarm, we can dump for local Compose use all those version numbers. And the reason I love this is because there were things in version 2 that never made it to version 3, like the depends on statement for health checks, which I love, and a lot of the other things like dealing with CPU and resource stuff and all sorts of stuff in 2 that never made it to 3. And then, so you had to make a choice, like, do I use it with 2 or do I use it with 3? Now, here's the thing, is we're not talking about Swarm today, but Swarm has not been updated to use the Compose specification or to use the new Docker Compose command line or anything like that. So Swarm is kind of left the way it was before, 2 years ago. You have to use a version 3 dot something. I think the latest version 3 is 3.8. So if you're using Swarm, you will stick with version 3.8 as your file format and all the features that come with that. All right. But we're not going to talk about Swarm today. We're just going to focus on the Docker Compose command line. So now there's this spec. And what does that really mean? Well, we didn't actually have a specification before where other tools could rely on this specification and how it would work. So what's nice is you can actually go in here, and this is now how you would go and learn, rather than just reading the documentation. You could dive into each and every feature of the specification and try to use it in your Docker Compose file. Now, a Docker Compose file is one way or one tool of the specification. There are now other tools that will use this specification. You can sort of follow down and you can read about like cloud providers using this, the Compose with a K, that tool, which is a way to convert a Compose YAML file into Kubernetes manifest files. That uses it. NerdCTL, which is a containerd tool. We should have a whole show on that one because it's kind of neat. But these other tools are using it. The Docker -Compose and now the Docker CLI are also ways of using this spec. But nevertheless, you can go here. And when you start to go down, it's a really big document. You start to find all the different things like profiles, which we'll get to in a minute. And it describes that part of the specification so that basically it's rules for the tools. So any tool that wants to implement this stuff, any other new tools that want to implement this specification, they have to do these things in this certain way and adhere to this spec, which is great because that's going to open up a lot of these tools out there that maybe wanted to use Compose, but would essentially have to reverse engineer it or look at the Compose file as the specification, which it really isn't. It's just an implementation of that spec. All right. So that is the next one. Where are we at? We're on 2. So we got the Compose spec. All right. So no more versions, as long as you're using the Compose command line tools or anything else that adheres to the spec. apt-get actually asks, can you use your own plugins with Docker? Absolutely. There is, if you just look up Docker plugins, you'll find one of the other captains, Lucas, creates a little utility that actually installs them for you. And there's not a ton of them. There's only really a small little list here. And a lot of these tools you can really just get as standalone command line tools, but this integrates them into Docker. So you can go check out those tools. He uses those as an example of how you can actually just write bash scripts that become the plugin. All right. All right, looking through the chat. All right. No questions so far? Cool. All right, so next up, service profiles, which I haven't really talked about here. So this is the first time you're going to hear me talk about service profiles, which is probably my most exciting new feature for me for local Compose use. Now, granted, we're going to talk about ways you can use the up command against remote infrastructure, which is also exciting. But for local use, service profiles has a really good use case, and that is using the same compose file, but not always spinning up all the same containers. In fact, using commands with a -- profile in it will allow you to put something in your YAML for each of your occasional services that you maybe need, and then you can spin those up without using a separate compose file. It can all be now in the same compose file. I used to have to make separate compose files. Maybe I would extend or use overwrites where I would have to add them in at the command line, but no more. You can now use service profiles. Let's look at it. Let's see if I've got something here. Actually, let me do VS Code. Maybe that'll be a little easier. All right. Now, what I can do is, this is one of my favorite demo apps. This is the voting app, or sometimes I call it dog versus cat. And it has 5 services. And if I didn't always want the result app when I do a Docker Compose up, one of the things I could do here is maybe I just want the result app. Maybe I'm the developer of the voting app, the front end, and we'll see that in a second. And there's someone else that's managing the result app in my team, right? But I don't always want the result app up. Now, I could do Docker Compose up space and list all the services that I want to come up, like vote, worker. You know, I could manually do that, but then I'd have to do that with every command, right? I would have to make sure that that stuff's there. And it could get kind of complex, especially if you start to get into real world applications and microservices. You'll end up with, you know, half a dozen, 24 services. And what you can do now is do profile, and I'm going to call this one result. All right. And back at my command line. By the way, you can see, oh, actually, I think it's plural. Yeah. Okay, so I technically already have these running, so let me bring this down. Now, one thing we'll talk about in a little bit is the enhanced UI. See how this UI is a little bit fancier? It's colored. It may have been colored before, actually. I know the logs were colored, but I'm not sure there. All right, so yeah, that's fine. There we go. All right, so if I do a Docker Compose up, you'll notice that it's going to create the networks, and then it's going to create the databases, and we can talk about things like the voting, the depends on feature, which I love talking about. What I meant to do was do that with a -D. John asked, M1 compatibility? Yes, these all work on ARM. Like Docker Desktop for M1, which is released, that has Docker Compose built into it. Yep. Yeah, how to get started with Docker? Link below for coupons to my courses. So getting started with Docker, I have an almost 20-hour course on Docker called Docker Mastery. You can get the coupon for that below. Peter asks, does the new Docker Compose CLI doesn't seem to support compose, ignore orphans. Have you encountered this issue? So if you have a concern, what I recommend you do, I don't have the answer to that specific question, but what I recommend you do is I've been filing bug reports and feature requests and all sorts of stuff. They have a team that's working on this full time. So go over to the Docker Compose website. So it's github.com/docker/compose CLI. All right. And then go to issues, which there are many. And, look for that. All right. So no one's talking about it. So put in a request to have that added. State the reasons why you need it and why you use it. Because what they're doing is they're getting rid of some of the stuff that nobody uses, because there's no reason to redevelop features that they put in 5 years ago that maybe no one's using anymore. So all the major ones are now there. They used to have a compatibility list because they were slowly building all the old features into the new one. Here's a checklist. And they've been going through adding all the features, and there's like almost all these things are checked, it seems like. So far, everything's checked. But you want to make sure that that's added. Not everything from the old one is making it into the new one. So put your vote in, right? This is open source. So they're going to build what we ask for. Yeah, these are all checked. This used to be, that was a long list. All right. It's actually closed. I think I just saw them actually just close it the other day because they were claiming that everything, all command and flags, but verbose, not applicable, are now supported, so closing. Okay, so maybe that's not true. They're not supporting your thing. Go check that out, and I recommend filing a ticket. All right, back over to our app. So you'll notice here that I did an up and I did not get the result service. The result service is now under a new profile that in order to bring it up, I would need to do a Docker Compose up. Actually, I think I do it here. -P for profile, result up. Okay, so result, oh, well, why is my result exited? Logs, result. I am writing the same file, yeah. Weird. I must have just broke this. All right. I will look at that in a minute. But the point here is that profiles are a way for you to segregate these out. Like you can separate your services now into chunks of them. And if you don't give a service a profile name, then all commands always run for that. So only, and let me state that the way I've used this, so you maybe can see a real world use case, is when you have, like I said, a big app that you don't want all the parts because that's maybe not what you're focused on, you're developing, or you maybe want one-off things. Maybe you have seeding data, and we can work on that in a little bit if we have time, where we can maybe have a container or a command that's in its own service that I'm only going to use once to seed data. And so instead of manually typing that command in every time, I would just do a Docker Compose -P profile. Oh, project. Chris is specifying that that's my problem. Yeah, you are right. There we go. Although I don't know why it crashed a while ago. So thank you for that. Yeah, I was messing around with the project, which I'm going to show you in a minute, but the project name, because that's something that's not new, but I wanted to show off this thing. Well, actually, we'll get to it. I don't want to skip ahead. Thanks for keeping me awesome there, Chris. So the other case I use it is for seeding data, and I use that more and more now. And in fact, in this particular voting app, I do have a command to seed data. And so what I would do is over in my VS Code, I would just add a brand new service, and I would probably use, like, let's say I had the seed data already in this image. I would just make a new service called seed, and then I would use that same one, and then maybe I'd have a new command that I would override, and then the profiles, I would call it seed, and then it would only run this when I specify an up or whatever. Now, you could always do a run command and type everything out manually, but if there's something that's really common, like a setup script that you have that seeds everything, does a rake command in Rails or something like that, I would put that in one of these new services, and I would give it its own profile. All right? So that's that. See what questions we've got. Robot Glock, the dot files are, well, I don't have a dot files that are public, but all of my terminal setup is over at bretfisher.com/shell. All right, bretfisher.com/shell. And then that's listing all, basically, the step. It's not so much a step-by-step, but this is what I layered on top, and then if there's anything custom, like my custom CLI look, I have some of that stuff there as well for the prompt. All right? I don't think I've updated it to show what I do now, which is this little blue line right here. I show my Docker context and my Kubernetes context, but if you look at enough of the examples in Oh My ZSH for a ZSH shell, it should be pretty easy to figure that out, because you're basically gonna put the commands in. But if you remind me later on Twitter or something, if you're interested in that, I will put up a gist of it, because I'll just put it up on a gist at that point. I'm not gonna do it right now, but all right, back to our list. Oh, apt-get. What if I write a new Docker Compose? Will the new version support both structures, version 2? Do you think they are going to cancel the version feature in the future? That's effectively what they've done. So yes, when you take out the version name, the version line, if you take it out, you get to use all the features of 2 and 3, all in a single file, and any new features that are part of the specification that never were in 2 and 3, like profiles, and that's essentially canceling the version. There are no more versions. If you want to use Swarm, you still have to use version 3. If you're for some reason using a really old version of Docker Compose, the Python version from over a year ago, then you could still use version 2 and 3, because it would no longer, those old versions don't support the Compose specification. But essentially, the version key and value are gone. There's no reason to put them in as long as you're using Docker Compose command line. All right. Whether it's the Python or the Golang version, they both now support versionless Compose specification. What this means is that it essentially, if the specification has a new feature, and then the Docker Compose command line adds that feature of the specification, it works in the file, right? So you don't have to specify a version to suddenly enable that feature, which was, they never really were fans of it. There was reasons back in the day, but a lot of people at Docker didn't think that was great, so they got rid of it. And I agree. Like, keeping up with which version and all the new stuff is what's in each version and which version I need for the particular feature was problematic. Music based on the version 2. I'm trying to understand if I can reach close to this form or not. So Docker Compose, we're talking about Docker Compose, the command line mostly. That command line does not, Docker Compose, the command line does not do anything with Swarm. It doesn't talk to Swarm, it doesn't deploy to Swarm. If you want to use Swarm, you have to use Docker service commands or Docker stack commands. And those use only the version 3 of the Compose file, right? Can I post all the links on Discord? So yes, Mike, the links so normally what I do is right after this live show, I put all the links that I use in the browser into the video. So if you come back later tonight to this same video, all the links will be in the YouTube file. I don't put them in Discord. I just put them right here in the YouTube video. Rowington, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean about dependency, so I'm not. Maybe ask your question in more detail. All right. Next up, Compose ls, a whole new command. Wasn't there before. And what this does is, because I was going to show you a while ago, Compose ls will show me different projects across my whole system. Now, you can also see this in the new Docker GUI. If you're into GUIs, Docker keeps making their GUI better. And you can see over here, this is actually listing all of my containers, as well as recognizing these Compose files. So down here at the bottom, it sees that I'm running 5 containers inside of Compose. So I can click here to open it right up in Visual Studio Code. I can stop it. I can start it. I can look at the logs of individual containers. I can get a shell right into that container. And I don't know if you've played around with the GUI, but it keeps getting better every release. In fact, just this week, they released this new feature where you can now see volumes and do things with those volumes like delete them, all here in the UI. And then they had this great new thing that they launched at DockerCon, but they've been playing with it all year. It's called dev environments, which we won't get into today. I'll have another video at some point about dev environments. But so basically, it's a way for you to share your code and your containers and everything all across Docker Hub with a one-click URL without having to push your containers to a registry manually or put your code in GitHub and change the branch. Like, you don't have to do any of that. This is basically an easy way to share your environment with other people. All right. It's meant for like coworkers who want to share something they're working on, but they don't necessarily want to commit it to Git in a certain branch and then push that branch. They want to just a quicker way to do it. Anyway, so now you can see I have these 3 different Compose files running, and you can see now if I go back to my terminal. So those are listed there. So the ls command didn't exist. So in order to see what was running, you would have to go to the directories where you ran them. And sometimes it took a little bit of time because I would do a Docker PS and I would see a bunch of stuff running, right? And I wouldn't know where that stuff was coming from. So then I couldn't remember which directory I was in to start those things. Well, no more. I don't know if that helps. Let me see what other options I have there. I think yeah, it's not. It would be nice if it was showing me the file path, because I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to tell where these things are from. I guess, because it defaults the name of a project. In case you didn't know this, Docker's Compose has always done this. The name of a project is always the name of the directory by default, but you can override it with something that I was messing with Docker a while ago, which is Docker Compose-P. All right. So if you look at the help, you can see that there's this option. Sorry, this one right here, -P is for project name. So you could always override that. You can override it with an environment variable as well. But by default, it will use the same directory you're in. And so if I want to spin up 2 copies of the same stuff in this directory, that's kind of what I've done here. All right. this new one, I just typed in Docker Compose in the same directory, and instead of typing Docker Compose up, I typed in p new up, and it launched a whole separate set of these services. Now, you'll have a problem doing this if you do a couple of things wrong. If you put in container name inside of your YAML, which I don't recommend you ever do, because the reason that people put the container name value in their compose file is usually because they want to use Docker commands, and the easy naming of the container is helpful for Docker commands. I would argue that I bet everything you do in Docker you could use with Docker Compose, and it's probably better and easier. So it's very, very rare that a developer ever needs to use a direct Docker command without Compose in it, because Compose is designed to do the things like logs, exec, run, start, stop, restart, down, up. Like, it has all those things. So you can pause, unpause, it's just push, pull. You can do all that stuff from the Compose itself, which is more friendly for developer workflows than the Docker command itself. So I would argue, don't ever do that. Don't ever manually name your containers in the YAML file. The second thing they'll run into is if you're trying to assign ports. So if you look at my Compose file, let's go over here. If you look at my Compose file, what I do here is I don't specify the port of my host machine. When I publish this port, I'm letting it auto-assign. That's what I do when I just list the port that the container is listening on inside the container network. It will now dynamically create the port. So when I do a Docker Compose PS, I will see what ports it assigned them. All right, so the ones I care about here. So it's assigning high ports. And so that way, if I spin up multiple versions, right? So if we do a Docker Compose p new, remember that other one I started up? So it's another copy of this. So if I do the same PS command, notice they're different ports, right? So that allows me to run the same thing twice. And there might be reasons for doing that. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll check out applications in different clones of that same app, and then change the I'll have them in different directories, and then I will change the branch or the commit that I'm on each one, so I can kind of test between two versions of something. And if you hard code the ports on your host machine, then you can't run two copies because you can only run one container on an external port. So I tend to not do that, and then I can get the random value here over there. All right. So that's LS. Now let's talk about BuildKit. Any ideas about integration with Databricks? I have no idea. I don't even know what Databricks is. So no need for Swarm anymore, at least for local development. Can it still be deployed to Swarm after? So Archimedes, good question. I never recommend Swarm for local development. I just don't see that. I don't see any advantages to it for local development. The Compose command line is absolutely designed for the developer workflow. Swarm is not, right? Swarm is like Kubernetes. It's designed for running services in production with automatic replacement when they fail. But, you know, there's no Swarm command, for example, to combine all the logs. Like, you can just do Docker Compose logs here, and you see all the logs from all the services, and they're all nicely colored and everything. You don't get that in Swarm. I could go on and on. There's lots of reasons why. For local development, you always want to use Compose. It's also using slightly less resources because there's stuff that Docker's doing in the background for Swarm that it doesn't need to do in Compose, right? In the background, really all Compose is doing is it's just converting what you're doing into the real Docker command to do that thing. So your other part of your question was, can it still be deployed to Swarm after? So remember my rule, like you can't do this. Like, first of all, we're talking about two different things, the YAML file format and the command line. The Docker Compose command line has never done anything with Swarm. It's just local. It's whatever engine you're running, it is talking to that engine, whether that engine is local or remote, but it's not ever doing Swarm things, right? Now, the YAML file, Swarm does use the version 3 of the YAML file. It does not adhere to the new Compose specification yet. It only adheres to version 3. So I guess maybe the answer is maybe. I'm not sure how to answer that one. Hopefully that helps. Does the network is common to all Docker Compose under the same profile? It depends on your setup in the YAML file. If your YAML file specifies whatever networks, then in that same project, so in the project, it names all the networks with the project name, right? So notice how I have hard-coded networks in here, and so it will create those networks, and they will all adhere to the standard of the compose file for network creation and all that. If you don't put any network stuff in here at all, that's totally fine. It creates a default network and assigns all containers to that default network, which compose has always done that, right? So there's nothing changed there. But yes, the answer to your question is yes, they're all in the same networks. Can you see the exposed ports when you do a Docker Compose PS? Yes, I think you just saw me do that. I'm catching up on chat. All right, so hopefully I fixed the screen issue, whatever that was about. All right, Compose, nope, we're talking about BuildKit. Builds with BuildKit. So this automatically, by the way, in chat, if there's something I missed because I was on the wrong screen, just let me know. I'm going to make it a little easier and just do this. All right. So with BuildKit, if I'm in this directory, and that one I don't have any. All right, so I'm in my example voting app, which is up on my GitHub, github.com/Bret Fisher/example voting app. All right, so this example voting app has the standard Docker Compose file. I'm just going to go over here and show you. This compose file has volumes and build commands. All right, so I can build over here. And if I do a Docker Compose build, it's going to automatically use BuildKit by default. Now, this build's actually going to fail because I was troubleshooting an issue earlier right before the show started and broke it. But the nice thing is you get the BuildKit output, and you get the advantages of BuildKit. And it does all sorts of things that are parallel, so it's going to be building faster. It's better parallel building and of different layers. If you're using multi-stage Docker files, it will skip stages it doesn't need because it's intelligent, unlike the old builder that would always build every stage regardless. And yeah, lots of other stuff in there that's an enhancement. A common question I get from people, by the way, if you're using BuildKit, is they want to see all the output, because until it gets an error, BuildKit tends to do a little bit of magic in the CLI. If you just wanted to output, maybe you're in your CI solution. So when you do the build, you can do progress plane, and this is a BuildKit option. It also works in Docker build commands as well, not just Docker Compose build. But that will make it normal text output and be verbose about all that, and it's better for logging and if you're in a CI solution. So anyway, pro tip there. All right, next up. So yeah, BuildKit's enabled by default. That's another advantage. Compose, copy. So if I do Docker Compose CP, this command did not exist before. You couldn't copy files in and out through Compose. You could with Docker CP. You could just, but then you would have to know the name of the container and all that. So because that command was missing and people were asking for it in the GitHub repo, people were asking for it, so they added it. I'm not sure if Docker added it. There might have been an open source contribution, but now you can copy files back and forth. I'm not going to demo that, but it works just like Docker. Compose convert. All right, so we had compose config in the old version, which was a little bit of a way for you to spit out YAML and sort of do a validation of the YAML. But now that's all been moved to something called compose convert, which does that and more. So if I do a Docker Compose convert, what it's going to do is it's going to take my YAML file and it's going to make it, it's going to output some of the defaults and some of the things that are more verbose. So you'll notice like it automatically assigns the name. So that it's basically, I think in the background, what's happening is these are the things that it needs to do on its own before it runs those Docker commands, like figure out the name of the network that it's going to create, figure out the name of the actual volume it's going to create, stuff like that. So you get an interesting stuff like the bind mounts and whatnot that's going to use the full file paths. So you get this output. Now, that's neat, but if you just do convert-q for quiet, what it'll do there is it's a validation. So this is something that you want to put in for linting, maybe in your CI, and you would just do compose convert-q, and it would present an error if you had something wrong with your YAML. All right, something else it can do, by the way, you can always do help, right? Something else you can do here is you can have it list things inside the compose file quickly and easily. So if I just want to see what volumes are here, I can do a -- volumes. Same for services. If I wanted to list all services, I can do -- services. So this is just sort of it going through the YAML, finding the things that you're asking for and spitting them out the command line. Anyway, there's some other stuff there, but go check out that new convert command. I missed the first part where there was a web page that lists what's new in Docker Compose v2. I couldn't find it easily. There's not really a web page. That's why I'm having this video. There is the repo. So I will put the repo back up. And you can read about stuff there, but it's not going to necessarily go through everything that's new since this project started. You can go through each release, which is kind of what I do. You can go through each release and see the change log. And if there's a new feature in that version, they will list it. So for example, here, they just recently added the CP command here, right? So that was a new feature. And yeah, so you could scroll back in time all the way to last year, or you could just watch this video. I get most of the things. Now, what's up next is compose up to ACI. Oh, wait, did I forget something? Oh, I got these backwards. So these I demoed last year. There's compose up to ECS, and then there's compose up to ACI. So these are the two drivers or plugins. I'm not sure what you want to, there's probably a better term for it that they're using that I don't know yet, haven't memorized. But these are ways to deploy, instead of to a Docker engine, to some other API that's not Docker. So when you do a Docker compose up, and I can walk through a little bit of this, but I'm not going to do the whole thing. It takes a while, and we've already been talking for an hour. So Docker, and by the way, you can just watch the keynote of DockerCon from 2 weeks ago, and they do all this stuff too. So to remind you, Docker has context. Docker context list. And it's a little ugly. Let me back out so that it's maybe not so ugly. Probably won't be able to read it, but I had this tiny little list of 4 different endpoints, and they no longer are only Docker engines. So Docker, the context was created so you could, just like with a kube control config context, you can point your local Docker command line to not just your local engine, but remote Docker engines over SSH or the API directly over TCP. All right, so you can do that. You can see that I've actually got one here where I point to a server using SSH. That's all you have to do is specify the endpoint of SSH://. If you look back in this channel on YouTube, I have other videos on that as well as in my Docker Mastery course. And then this is the default one. It always comes with the default. When you install Docker Desktop, it always uses this one by default. And then I have another one. This is another web server that I built in the cloud, just a Linux server that I don't have the TCP port enabled because I don't recommend you do that for Docker anymore. Just use SSH. And I just have this little endpoint right there, right? So I can change these with a Docker context command. Compose now adheres to that context command. So if I were to do Docker compose context use this one, you'll see the type. Notice this column here. There's a type. Moby has always been the type for Docker engine. It really should just say Docker, but it says Moby. which is the open source project that Docker is based on. Anyway, now they have these new types, and ACI, which is Azure Container Instances, I believe is the name of that, is a type. And if you log in, you have to do a Docker login ACI, and you have to go through this process. But once you've got logged in and authenticated, you can now create this profile. I created the profile name of dog versus cat. So now I can do a Docker. Let me go over here. Oh, I'm in the right directory. Okay. Docker context use dogs versus cats. So that will change to use my excuse me, my ACI Azure. So now I'm pointing it at Azure. Here's the thing though, it's not talking to Docker directly. It's talking to the APIs in Azure's cloud and using Azure's ACI service. And now when I do a Docker compose up, it will spin up that compose file with ACI, nothing to do with my local Docker engine. In fact, I could not have a local engine installed. I just have the Docker compose command line, which is a plugin now for Docker. So just those two binaries on my machine, and as long as I've authenticated to ACI through Docker login, I think Azure. If you just do that, it'll go through the process of logging you into Azure. So if you do that, now you can deploy to the cloud. So here's the thing. Here's my little soapbox. People talk about the future of Swarm, and I'm a diehard Swarm fan, and it's eventually, we just got, by the way, an update this week that it is getting storage enhancements like Kubernetes. The CSI is still being worked on daily. Drew is the lead developer, and he is working hard on that, and you can see the commits if you go and you dig in the repos in GitHub. But that's coming to Swarm someday. Maybe this year, maybe not. But Swarm was Docker's old way of thinking. It's not so much that they gave up and decided that Kubernetes is the winner. I would argue that maybe some of that's true. But what I think happened is that they started to realize that they're not an orchestration company. They were a developer tooling company. So when they sold off all their assets a year and a half ago, what was left was a core team of people, less than 100 people, and they're focusing on developer tooling. Developers don't want to manage servers. Right? I'm an ops person, so my job is largely to manage servers and infrastructure, but I'm getting out of that too. I'm trying to avoid having to SSH into servers. I don't want to have to manage servers because we're all having to do more with less. And I would rather just manage API access with command line tooling. And that's what the new Docker is doing. So Docker now approaches this of don't deploy to a Docker engine that you manually installed on a server and then opened it up to the internet. That's the old thinking. The new thinking is, if you're going to use the cloud APIs that they already provide, and Azure, and now you can use the best of Azure, the best of AWS, and maybe eventually DigitalOcean. Instead of thinking of you talking to a server directly, let's deploy to what that cloud's version of container hosting is like. So in this case, now I'm using this, so I can now do a Docker compose up or Docker compose PS. And it will go, and I was having error, and I broke something again before, and it's not working. But anyway, if this were to work, it would do a Docker compose up, and it would bring up in Azure my containers just like it does locally. It would give me an endpoint, a URL that I would go use to get to that server. So it's creating the server, and it's installing the containers, and I don't even know whether it's actually using Docker. That's not actually the point. What I'm using is Azure's ACI, whatever that means. There's another one. You can use ECS with AWS. So now I can use Docker login. I'm just going to try this and see if it works. Yeah, so I could log into AWS there, which I'm not going to do, but I could log into AWS, and now they have a driver and a context for EC2. I'm sorry, not EC2, ECS, which is technically in the background using Docker, but it's their own orchestrator. Again, this isn't about Swarm or other orchestrators. It's more about what is that cloud's opinion on how to run containers, and can Docker interface with that cloud's APIs. So what we should start to expect is maybe someday there'll be EKS version or a Fargate version, or other way. Maybe there's DigitalOcean apps, which is a new thing from DigitalOcean. So there's all sorts of ways of running containers now on the internet. Heroku can run containers now, and what we're hoping is that Docker will make more of these, or they'll at least allow vendors to add these in or help with these so that we can now not just deploy to Docker Engine, but also now ACI with Azure and then ECS with AWS. All right. And it will have some of the features, maybe not all, but some of the features of that platform. Now, if you're interested more in this, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but the documentation is great. If you just search Docker Compose ACI, right? Docker Compose ACI, you will find Docker's documentation on the features, the integration, how it works, a walkthrough. You'll also find Microsoft's documentation because it's their cloud and they want to use Docker Compose. So you can now read all their documentation and tutorials. So all that stuff's out there. All right. The same goes for ECS. If I just type in ECS, then you're going to get that same documentation for deploying to ECS. We don't know from Docker what their next driver is going to be, if that's the right word, but more are probably coming. All right. So that's my soapbox moment there, is that one of the reasons they're not focusing on Swarm anymore is because they're not trying to be a server operations and orchestration company, which is more ops, right? Not so much dev. And devs like to deploy to whatever they already have in the cloud. And that's why these integrations are really interesting to me, I think. Well, I haven't quite seen teams take this and run with it as production stuff, but the next one might be the one. So the final big thing I'm going to talk about today is Docker Compose up for Kubernetes. So imagine just being able to specify that Docker context, which already covers Kubernetes endpoints. You saw me do this. All right, so Docker context list. All right, and there is a Kubernetes endpoint here. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the endpoint of my local machine's Kubernetes. All right. Docker is working on, and we don't know what the release timeline is, but if you go and you custom build this new Compose CLI, you can get out of the box a way to deploy to Kubernetes from Compose using a Compose file and ignoring manifest or Helm charts or anything, which is, I think, a pretty big deal. Yeah. Yeah, big deal. So this is what I've been asking for at least a year or two. Everyone else has been asking for it. So I don't have it working today, but I imagine it would do exactly what you think. And here's the other cool part, is that you can use the Compose other commands to get the results back from Kubernetes, so that you don't just do an up and then have to shift over to kube control. You will start to be able to see other commands showing up, like the PS command and maybe the logs command. And I've been having to dive into the open source. If you look at the open source repo and in the commits and the pull requests, you can see that this stuff is getting worked on, but Docker really hasn't released it yet for beta testing. And I don't have a date on that, but when I do, you're going to know. So I'm very excited about that. And I think that that is going to be probably the most used deployment methodology for all these different ways of deploying to the cloud, right? Because Docker could make an EKS, a Google Kubernetes. There's all these different Kubernetes, but if you just get a standard Kubernetes API and you can adhere to that spec, it doesn't really matter where that's running, right? So the one thing this won't do, though, is this wouldn't provision, right? If you're just going to deploy to Kubernetes, that Kubernetes has to already exist. So Docker Compose isn't going to be the provisioning tool. But I would argue that for Kubernetes, every hosted Kubernetes out there and every Kubernetes distribution already has the commands to do that. So I'm not sure that Docker needs to replace those or wrap those in any way. I think it's probably safe to say that those tools are fine. We spin up the infrastructure with those tools, and then Docker Compose up to Kubernetes is the way you deploy your apps. And there is yet to be seen what exactly of the entire Kubernetes spec will go into the Compose file, but I would expect to see, services become deployments, and then if you specify a port, that becomes a service. If you specify an external port, it might automatically use ingress. Obviously there's volumes there for persistent volume claims and stuff like that. So we're gonna have to see how Docker does it, but they're starting to add information. If you want to dig around on their website, and I am not the expert yet on this, so maybe I will have someone on the show that knows a lot more about it in the coming weeks as this thing keeps getting worked on. All right? Let me go look at chat, see what questions we have. Chris says it's better to pretend there is no compose up to ACI. Yeah, I don't use Azure, and I don't have any customers that use Azure ACI, so I only use it for demo purposes, of which is why it's currently failing, because I probably didn't do something right in the YAML file. There is no Docker Compose up to Swarm. That would be Docker Stacks. Magor, configure Octopus container on Windows. I don't even know what that is. So sorry, we're talking about Compose today. Yeah, my suggestion is to create an alias to set the context for the command. That way you don't have to keep track or accidentally do something in the wrong context. I agree. I actually have a lot of Docker Compose command line stuff. I don't use it in demos. I don't use these aliases in demos because it would confuse people. But if you just did a Docker, let's see. If I just did that, I've got a whole bunch of these that I use. So I can just do a DCO, Docker Compose, or DCUP for Docker Compose up, stuff like that. And these used to have all dashes in them, but then recently, now that this product has gotten more stable, I have converted all of them so they use the new Docker Compose v2. So I took the dash out, and now they're all spaces. I'm catching up on your questions here. Ibrahim, I'm actually not going to address your question today because I'm focusing on Compose, but thoughts on automating the whole configuration process of your dedicated servers? It's just more work. I mean, if that's your job and you want to do that, then it's up to you. Every team that I work with, they have too much work, not enough people, and they're always dealing with new stuff that they need to deal with. So they usually want to do anything they can to not always save money, although that's always a factor, but to not need to hire more people because typically the people are more expensive than the infrastructure. So usually the teams I'm working with, if they have their own infrastructure, they're looking at ways to automate it. Obviously, there's lots of tools out there to do that. But I think that, the trend I see is that the more services the cloud creates and the more features those have, the more people use them because they're doing more with less. There's less people in the team. And so the typical DevOps person I'm working with now, 5 years ago, they would have needed 2 or 3 people to do the job of that one person because the tooling's gotten better and the services on the internet have gotten better and provide more features. So you can definitely administrate a lot more stuff with one person now than you used to be able to do. And that's largely because of the cloud, but also because of better tooling. So, yeah, Chris, I don't think they're ever going to do that. I honestly don't think Compose up to Swarm. Just because the only thing I see Docker doing in the last year or two is Mirantis is now the ones maintaining SwarmKit. They're the ones putting in the PRs and stuff. And Docker supports them by, committing them and putting them in new releases and stuff like that. But there's not a single person that I'm aware of at Docker, the company, dedicated to Swarm. And I have not seen a new feature built by an internal employee at Docker for years. And the person that did that now works at Mirantis and is working on the storage support for Swarm. We did get, at the beginning of this year, one new feature with Swarm where you can now run jobs. I had to think about it for a second. So there's Docker Docker jobs or Docker, yeah, Docker service type job. I think it's Docker service create dash type equals jobs, I think, or mode. I can't remember. But yeah, so a one-off one run job, not a cron job because they didn't add that yet, but just the jobs. Anyway, that's the only thing that's created in Swarm. So I don't see the Docker team investing more into the tooling to add new features, but this is open source. So someone out there could add this feature to use Docker Compose up with the compose file to Swarm. It's possible, but it would have to create services, not Docker, and that's a lot of work because none of that code is in there yet. So we can hope, but I don't think it's realistic. Let's see. Oh, why does it say Swarm in my context? Because there's a little feature that's been around for years. So Archimedes is asking about this. The default orchestrator. So it's always been there. It's actually super hard to see. But over here on the right, it says orchestrator. And you can change in your Docker config. So if I just cat out, let's see. I'm not sure I have one actually. Oops. Yeah, the config.json. So inside this file, and it doesn't work on a dark screen. So in there, actually it doesn't state it. Well, you can in here, because I probably haven't changed the default. The default is Swarm. But you can change, when you do a Docker stack, you can actually change it. This is an old thing. It's an old way that you used to be able to deploy to Kubernetes from a Docker stack command. But Docker doesn't support that anymore. It was a very old idea. It's basically a Kubernetes add-on. It wasn't even really an operator or a controller. It was just a container that ran in Kubernetes. And you could actually do Docker stack deploy with a compose file, and it would go through translation and actually be deployed to Kubernetes. So this new feature of deploying to Kubernetes is, I think, it maybe the third different way that Docker has had to deploy to Kubernetes. The other one was called Docker app. And they've kind of gotten rid of all those things now, and now they're focusing on compose. So not to distract you, but that thing in there with the Swarm is from old days. What brand of coffee am I drinking? I'm drinking tea. I'm drinking some Slippery Elm tea in a Docker cup. All right. See if we have any more questions. Context stuff looks really cool. Best way to get up on it. John, just go look at the Docker docs. They have the examples of it. So Docker context. And yeah, in the docs, working with context right there first. So it'll go and talk through and give you examples and all that right in the docs. Is it possible to mount secrets and SSH agent with Docker Compose and BuildKit? Yes. It works the same way it always has. You have to, when you're talking about BuildKit, you have to change your Docker file and use the different thing at the top, if you know what I'm talking about. And if you just look up BuildKit SSH, you'll find all that stuff about that. But that's not, it works with Compose because Compose is just using the BuildKit tool. So it's really a BuildKit feature, not so much a Compose feature. So you could technically do this with the old Compose as well, if you were using BuildKit with the old version of Docker Compose. It's a good question. Thank you, Mohammed. Is there any recommendation tool for Compose logging? Recommended tool for Compose logging. apt-get, I'm not sure. Docker Compose logs, I'm not sure what else you need than that. So maybe if you have a different question, specify it a little more clearly. Your apps inside the containers, in all containers, regardless of what tool you're using, Kubernetes, Docker, Compose, whatever, they should always be logging to standard out and standard error. That is the 12-factor way that we've all been using for a decade, or at least that's been the standard for a decade, sort of in the cloud native space. And containers adopted that. So if that's what you're asking, yeah, standard out, standard error. No, you don't need any special libraries like you used to have to, where you would dump it, create a bunch of different logging directories and all that. You don't need that anymore. Anton, any thought about adding new stuff to the Udemy course? I have been actively working on the courses all year. Right now, I'm in the middle of breaking and fixing a lot of things in my examples to work on Apple M1 ARMs as well as Raspberry Pis. So a lot of people are using ARM now in the courses, and not all of the containers work on ARM, and a lot of the utilities don't have ARM builds. So I'm having to spend way more time than I ever thought actually working with the tool makers to get them to build on ARM, or forking their code and making ARM versions. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on. If you want to see like an example of it, I have, let's see if I can show you just the mess of things that are happening when it comes to multi-platform building. If I go over here and I jump into my shpod directory and I just cat out the Docker file, this Docker file, like, this is all one run line, and it's to download binaries depending on which platform it's built on to create different images for each platform type. So now I'm building for Intel AMD 64, ARM 64, which is ARM v8. That's what Apple's using. That's what modern Raspberry Pis are using. And then older ARM Raspberry Pis are using ARM v7. So it'll now download the proper tools, and I'm having to do this across dozens of repos. So at least a dozen. So far, I think I've gotten through a dozen. So that's what I'm working on in the course. What's coming next in the course is you can actually end the Docker mastery course. I'm not really sure what's going to be new, but there's definitely going to be some stuff about this, all this new compose stuff that'll eventually get into there, as well as WSL2. And then the Kubernetes mastery course is getting more stuff that's listed at the bottom. It's been way too long since I've added any new stuff to the Kubernetes mastery course. So I'm going to add that too. Great question. All right. Ibrahim, yes, I agree. Yep, absolutely. Did you have any videos on multi-platform builds? That's a great question. I don't, other than in this channel. If you go back in my live streams and look, there's some ones that talk about Apple M1, and I do go a little bit into it. I don't have a multi-platform part of the course. If you took my Docker for Node.js course, that course has some stuff in it about using Node multi-platform and how easy it is. So the lessons, there are some lessons in there, and I talk a little bit about BuildKit. But what really needs to probably happen is just a dedicated small course that goes through a bunch of examples of multi-platform building. What I do now is, what you've seen people do in the past is they have different Docker files for each architecture, and then they build a different named image for each architecture. And that's kind of the old way of doing it. Now what you do is you make one Docker file that builds for all platforms, and they're not normally this ugly. Like, the reason this one's ugly is because I'm downloading a bunch of different binaries, but sometimes your Docker files won't even have to change. And then when you're building, you use the Docker buildx command. So just go look up Docker buildx, and that buildx command uses the new BuildKit builder, and you can specify a platform command there that you can do something so easy like Docker buildx build platform, and you see this. So I could build this on 3 platforms all at the same time, and then if I actually put in there push, I think that's push. That might not be the right command. It would automatically push all 3 of those images to the same repo, and would use a manifest file, which we're not going to get into, but essentially would mean that when you ran that container on all the different types of platforms, they would all just run. It would automatically work. There wouldn't be a separate image name or whatever. So just look up Docker BuildX build or platform build. And I think that's all in the docs. Docker has done a lot of stuff in the docs. So Docker Docker has put a lot of stuff in here. So yeah, building multi-platform. So they've got stuff all over their website about multi-platform. Definitely go check out that stuff until I get a major enhancement to my courses, which will happen eventually. Great question. All right, so I've been going for almost an hour and a half, so I'm going to give you one last chance. Any questions on the new Compose? They're about to release version 2. You can see on their website that the latest release is this new beta 3. So we could expect like the official version to come out here pretty quickly. I don't have a date or anything, but this is just a week old. And supposedly this repo may go away or something, or they may move some of this stuff to the original Docker Compose repo or something. So this is meant to replace the Python Docker-Compose, but it doesn't have, or until recently, it didn't have all the features, and it may still not have them all. So they've got to get it to a place where it's stable enough and has all the features so that they can finally replace the Python. Then they will deprecate the Python version, and this one is just in all ways better, I think. It's easier to install. I don't have to worry about Python. You just have to download a single binary and put it in the plugins directory, you know. So I'm looking forward to that. Can you do Compose to build X cross-platform? Yeah. So when you do, it's automatically going to work. So you have to specify the platform, and the way that works is well, it's in the wrong directory. Docker Compose build, and you will see. Let's see. It's kind of weird. Yeah, the build command here is not, it doesn't seem to have its own help. What am I missing? I'm assuming the build command's there. Huh. Okay, so maybe the build command isn't implemented. Or maybe I've got a problem. Oh, I know why. My context. Docker context use default. So yeah, so it's going to be smart and not show me that because I can't build an ACI. So right here, it's not specifying platforms. So no, I would just assume that it would have worked. But that's actually a good question. I guess that doesn't work yet. I have to ask for that. Compose build. Yeah. Okay, so that's not implemented. I would have thought it would have been. Let's go over and find out. Let's go to the I'm going to search for multi-platform. Okay, I'm going to do in title. Okay. I'll take platform into account. So it looks like it's there. Yeah, so it may be something in there, but I may not understand exactly how it's working now. This is me. Oh my goodness. I love it when I put in a GitHub issue for a problem and then I forget. So you can specify the platform, but I don't know that this is for building, but you can specify the platform that you want to run of a specific image. And this is a great example of if you're on an Apple M1, there is no MySQL image. So if you went in your compose file, you could actually hard code the platform that it needs to pull that image for, so it would run it in emulation on an M1. So this actually fixes a problem with MySQL in my courses, actually, where people will need to do this if they're on an M1, so that it knows to try to pull that image instead when you're using Compose. When you're doing a Docker standard pull command, you can do Docker pull -- platform and manually override Docker and pull any platform's image. And if you have QEMU installed, which Docker Desktop comes with it will automatically emulate that platform on whatever you're running on. All right. But if you go back in my YouTube video archives throughout this whole year, I've been talking about Apple M1, and a lot of that I go into details about QEMU, multi-platform, stuff like that. All right. Yeah, Charlie's pointing out that's why I put these on the command line. And you know what I probably should do? I probably need to update my my little script here that creates these commands. I probably need to go in there and change them so that if it's not the default, that it's like red, because I change it, but I don't ever look at it and I forget. So having them here isn't enough. I think I need to change, like I need to make them bold or maybe red text or something that will stand out. Anyway, that's a great point. And that's why I put them there. If you wanted to look at that, it's in my dot files. Custom themes. I think it's this one. Yeah. Yeah, so I do this prompt here where I go and I do a kube control context. It's kind of why my shell is slow. Because my shell, every time I hit enter, and it's running a Docker command, a Kubernetes command, all in the background. So it's a little slow. I'm okay with it though. Anyway, all right, that's it. Yeah, yeah. Chris is talking about this. This is like the common accident of DevOps, and the one thing I tend to do is I'm an iTerm. So what I will often do, and this doesn't always help. Because a lot of these commands, when you change the context, you're changing it for every shell in your entire machine. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll run these things through a Docker, like I'll run Docker in Docker or kube control in Docker. And that way I can change the context in there. And then it's one of these things where you have to maybe copy the files in, because like it'll change things in the config files and still affect things. Anyway, so there's ways to get around it where I run things in containers. And the other thing I will do is, this is specifically an iTerm thing. So in the iTerm, for each window, I can make a badge. So I do production, and then it shows up in my window up here. And so when I come over to this window, I know that, pay attention, Bret. So that's another thing I do. You could also create a separate profile where that looks different or has a different theme, but yeah. Well, Chris, that's a great point. I still use Docker host a lot. I mean, context to me is just as much work as using Docker host, and the only advantage to the context is that you can have more complicated, endpoints, names, and stuff like that. And you can just tell I only have a few and I don't use them that often. So I'm always using Docker host. And what we're all talking about here is I can SSH to any machine. I can do like Docker host. So I can do something like that. And then it will go over SSH to a machine in my closet. It's called Ubuntu on my local network, Ubuntu, and it will go get the data. It'll run the commands on that server. So you can do that, and that will automatically tunnel any of your commands through SSH to whatever you type in that server there. So, yeah, pro tip. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Thanks to my patrons for keeping this show alive and giving me a little bit of coin for my coffee and tea habit. And I will see you all next week. I don't think we have a guest yet, but stay tuned. If you're on the Patreon, you will see the announcement whenever we plan the show next week. And I will see you this time, same time next week. Ciao.